In this video, I'll talk about the Apple Network Server 500. The Apple Network Server was announced February 26, 1996, discontinued April 1997. It has a PowerPC 604 processor running at 132 MHz. It came with 32 megabytes of RAM installed.
And then something that we'll hope to get out late this year or early next year is a Unix server. And we think Unix is a pretty lousy operating system to put inside a workstation. It's old technology and it's really big and you need a Winchester, so you can never make the workstations cheap. But we think it's a great operating system when you're in a multi-user environment. And what we're going to be doing is coming out with a server, which is a large disk, a very fast CPU that hangs on the network, that allows you to run Unix and vertical applications on top of it and use the Macintoshes and Lisa's as really sort of new wave terminals.
That wouldn't happen for a long time. But Steve actually did have a goal of building a next-gen workstation with a user-friendly Mac OS running on top of strong Unix underpinnings. Steve's team called it Big Mac, which didn't happen either. After several failed prototypes, Apple's management was not buying into Steve's vision. Steve left Apple, taking the idea to his new company, Next.
People told us they loved Next Step and that it was 3, 4, 5 years ahead of anything else they'd ever seen in the industry. And they loved the fact that we built it on top of Unix, because together this gave them the multitasking that they really wanted. It gave them the transparent networking that they needed. It gave them the object-oriented development environment so that they could build applications in a third of the time.
And Apple took the easy route to quick profits and built the Macintosh 2, using some of the Big Mac hardware development that had already been done, hence the codename Little Big Mac. Now, I'm not going to dump on the Macintosh 2, it's a great machine in its own right, just not the machine Steve had in mind. And Apple did really well through the 80s, but soon realized the 90s would bring challenges that they were now not particularly well positioned to meet. Limitations of the Mac OS, as well as the 68K processor, would be coming to a head in this decade. Apple CEO John Sculley had been trotting out a rapidly expanding product line of expensive Macs for the short term. That's a nice collection, John. But he didn't want Apple to become solely dependent on the Macintosh and its uncertain future. So his latest strategy was to diversify and expand Apple's reach into other markets.
Ever since John Sculley told CES that Apple would be entering the consumer electronics field, everyone has been speculating on what the products might be. The current rumor is that Apple and Sharp are working together to produce a Pocket Mac, a handheld organizer with full computer power.
Aside from PDAs, there would be cameras, video game systems, marathon on Pippin, alright, and servers. With AppleShare, users had had the ability to turn their off-the-shelf Mac into a server since 1987, but there had never been an actual server product. With his new strategy, Sculley founded the Server Group, and their first product was the Workgroup server line in 1993. The most popular and powerful, a Quadra 950 running at about double the performance thanks to a special PDS card. It was called the Apple Workgroup Server 95. And the speed was reflected in the price. But you were buying the most powerful 68K Mac that would ever be made. Sorry, Quadra 840 AV. This system allowed up to 60 users with fast performance, and the only Mac to ship with the AUX operating system, which was Apple's Unix operating system with the Macintosh System 7 graphical interface running on top of it. AUX, by the way, was created with the expensive Unix license Steve Jobs bought for the abandoned Server and Big Mac projects. It was ported to Macintosh hardware by Unisoft, a company that specialized in the process. I keep talking about it, but what is Unix? Well, as Steve Jobs said, even in 1984 it was an old operating system, developed in the 60s and 70s by Bell Labs, and emphasized simplified structure and a community approach to computing with its C programming language. It was a revolution and became very popular for mainframes and mini-computers. Organizations licensed their own version or cloned Unix, resulting in many variants. Like there's the early branches in the mid-70s, BSD, Xenix. Dude! With all this development input, by the 80s it became very robust. It was multi-user and multitasking, plus the software was very portable between microprocessors. That's the reason Steve Jobs used it for NeXT, and the reason Gil Amelio bought NeXT to finally replace the aging Mac OS. The upshot being that the Mac OS represents the largest installed base of Unix on computers today. But in the 90s, Apple just wanted something beyond the workgroup server. They wanted an enterprise-level network server because that's where the high profit margins were, especially in markets Apple was dominating, like publishing, where you needed to move huge files around. In the network server market, one server sale would equal the profits of 20 to 30 desktop sales. Now, AUX was not rewritten for the PowerPC, so development had been discontinued at that point. Apple approached PowerPC partner IBM to use their successful Unix flavor, known as AIX or AIX, since it was 100% PowerPC code. On the hardware side, a new design was commissioned. Apple contracted Lunar to help design a new network server product. Now, network servers were nothing new, so Apple wanted to design something different from the competition, something that was distinctly Apple. The collaboration produced Apple's largest computer ever at 24.5 inches tall, a double-wide full tower weighing from 84 to 92 pounds. That's heavier than Apple's original laser writer, and heavier than any of their 20 and 21-inch CRT monitors. It also outweighs the iPod Shuffle. Okay, turn that off. The Apple Network Server was born, and often referred to by the acronym ANS, which unfortunately some clowns would pronounce anus. The server started shipping in April 1996, and two models were offered, the 500 and 700. The 500, codenamed Shiner LE, meaning low end, and the 700, Shiner HE, high end. And what did Shiner mean? Well, it was just the server team's favorite beer. It used the fastest PowerPC processor Apple had at the time, the 604, 132 MHz for the 500 model and 150 MHz for the 700 model. But strangely was the only computer model where they didn't tattoo the beige case with the PowerPC logo. Apple's price list shows the steep cost businesses paid. $8,819 for a bare-bones 500, and $10,969 for a 500 server with basic functionality. Prices go up from there. Oh, and you were required to bundle the AIX OS for an extra $1,489. So I don't know why it had to be purchased separately except to make the servers look cheaper. Of course, the workgroup server line continued to be available. At this time it was the 8550, another great machine. Then there was the 7250 and the first generation 6150. Really, Apple? 5 months later, here's the August 1996 Macworld, where Apple unveiled the first 604E processor Macs, including the first multi-processor Mac, the 9500 180MP. Funny that as they were demoing the server on the show floor, CEO Gil Amelio was indicating Apple's future plans may not include a network server line.
First and foremost is we want fewer core products.
But September 9th, Apple released a third version of the server with the 604E processor running at 200 MHz. Instead of offering just 2 and 4 GB high-speed Scuzzy drives, you now have the option of a 9 GB drive for $2,500. A 604E 200 MHz upgrade card would be available for the existing 500 and 700 owners for $1,600, and the original servers would continue to be sold at very slightly discounted prices. It was all downhill from there though, despite what Apple was saying about the server division being safe. More price cuts followed to promote sales, and by April 1997, the Apple Network server was discontinued. It was all part of even deeper cuts Amelio had to make to keep Apple in business. Then in the May issue of Macworld, a rave review of the 200 MHz server. With Emilio's cancellation, plans were scrapped for 2 server products in development, a multi-processor version with dual processors, and a lower-end 300 model, with only 2 drives as shown in this prototype, codenamed Deep Dish. In the final analysis, many blame the failure on the lack of vision for the product. Server group leader Brenton Baker was said to be indecisive and difficult. Indeed, in this February 1997 Network World interview, he talks about maybe opening it up for macOS installation, or maybe using Intel processors. Intel? Another gripe people had with the servers, AppleShare wasn't even ported over. Instead, they gave you a couple third-party demos that you could try before you buy. In the years following cancellation, the servers would slowly be obsoleted by businesses that had them, like this one someone found thrown outside. Their size and lack of usefulness beyond a business server eroded their secondary market value very quickly and ensured they would almost all be destroyed or abandoned. In fact, the Brantford Computer Museum calls it one of the rarest Apple products. Now, I credit the Brantford Museum for sparking my interest in the server. Before then, it was whatever. Hey, the new Pippin. Brantford is located between the 2 Great Lakes, Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, the nearest large city being Hamilton.
Show yourself! What do you make of it?
Fascinating.
Could it be a Klingon space creature?
Possibly. Or somebody from Hamilton.
Museum curator Syd Bolton began collecting computers when everyone else was throwing them to the curb. And in 2005 he started a museum on his property which he opened once a month to the public. And this is where I first saw the server. I was so blown away that I took this blurry picture. I had to make a video about this machine. Syd's mission was to educate youth on computer history and be a place for people to play with computers that they had used so long ago.
I can tell you from people that come through our doors, the amount of emotion you see when people get back to a computer maybe they used 10 years ago, something they spent a lot of time on. It's really rewarding. That's one of the things that I love about this place, is that the look on people's face when they get that nostalgic feeling coming back.
Every machine is hands-on at his museum, from the earliest personal computers to the latest computer tech. Plus other artifacts, as he calls them, software, games, huge collection. A couple leases in the corner here, next cube there. He rotated the computers on display since he didn't have a huge amount of room. I asked Syd if I could do videos based on the computers in his collection, starting with the server. Syd liked the idea and was eager to share the story of the museum and computer history. But before anything could get started, Syd passed away suddenly at the age of only 46. A tragic loss. The fate of his collection, cause of death, I don't know the sad details.
This is it. This is the moment. I am actually going to eat this 1992 Cadbury cream egg.
Okay, well, I hope it wasn't that. Regardless, the museum is now permanently closed, and plans for a server video died with him. I mean, at the turn of the century, the servers could be found for almost nothing on eBay. But here in 2019, they're a little hard to come by. Of course, if the story had ended there, you'd just be watching my next Macintosh video, featuring a Mac every collector gets excited about, the 7300. Yeah, I said we're not doing that. Because, completely at random, a viewer of these Macintosh videos, John Purdy, left a comment asking if I want to borrow his Apple Network server for a video. And so, here we are. If you didn't want to watch that whole boring build-up, you could have advanced to this timecode. Sorry, I should have mentioned that earlier. Obviously, the most fascinating draw to this machine is the multi-award-winning design, built from scratch as a server. Apple advertised that any component could be replaced in 60 seconds, including the motherboard. The server had the standard Apple curved front bezel design, with the rest of the machine being painted metal. But unlike metal case Macs Apple built in the 90s, this metalwork actually looks good. The bottom section is PowerBook gray plastic, setting it off from the standard platinum Macintosh color in the top. Same color scheme as the PowerBook Duo Dock on the market at the same time. The bottom section holds the power supply. Access is simple. There are two opposing buttons shaped to your thumbs. Press and pull away the cover. This 500 model has a 325 watt power supply, where the 700 had a 425 watt with an option to add a second for redundancy. But the power supply was easy to swap out anyway. Handles allowed you to pull the power supply out. Mind you, this one is missing the handle on the power supply. The power supply cabinet is lined with a bronze metallic paint used to block interference from the power supply that could affect the rest of the server and surrounding devices. Bronze seemed to be a popular paint color at the time, also used in this 1995 Quadra 950, and again this 1995 Duo Dock. Because of the size, it had wheels. The only Apple computer to have wheels up until the 2019 Mac Pro offered them as an option. The wheels only roll back and forth, but are really handy for something this big. When you remove the cover, there are levers revealed on each side. Push them down to lock the wheels of the server. You plug in at the back and have the option to secure the power cord with screws, because there should be no reason to unplug it. The server has a front speaker, and if we pulled this panel away, on the reverse side we see the signatures of the team. It was probably the last time that Apple let the team sign their work in the tradition of Steve Jobs in the original Macintosh. The front also features a backlit liquid crystal display. This gives the status of the machine. On the right side, 7 removable drive bays, plus an integrated floppy drive. First, let's talk about the floppy drive.
So let me break this down for you.
No, DP, we're not going to dwell on the floppy drive. It's the same manual insert auto eject unit you would get on any Mac at the time. The floppy is built in, but each tray below it is completely removable and could hold up to 5¼ inch half-height drives like a CD-ROM. Each tray has an LED clip inside, so drive activity could be visually displayed. Okay, let me pull a carrier with an actual hard drive in it. This is the only hard drive on this particular server. The back of the tray is equipped with a 50-pin connector card, which is called the Interconnect Drive Board. There was also a 68-pin card available for the high-speed Scuzzy 2 drives. It adapts the connection to plug into the backplane connector of the server. Here's a closer look at the connector, and there's the port it plugs into on the backplane board. Simply push it back in to mate the drive connector with the backplane board. Each tray has this simple but smartly engineered gear system which allows the device to be plugged and unplugged precisely from the backplane connector. This allowed hot swapping of the drives, necessary with servers. The CD-ROM was standard, but for whatever reason missing on this machine. They were normally outfitted with a quad-speed drive. This one does have a DAT tape drive, which takes 4mm DAT tapes. That's digital audio tape. As you can see, it's quite a bit different than those old 4mm analog cassette tapes. This was an Apple-branded 4GB tape drive, but lacking an interconnect board to connect it to the backplane. That's okay, I don't have much stuff on DAT. With the 604E server release, they also announced availability of a 20 gigabyte 8mm tape drive for $2,500. Given the cost and timing, I doubt you would find one of these on an Apple Network server. The server has 3 Scuzzy buses, a standard external Scuzzy 1 bus, and 2 Scuzzy 2 fast and wide buses for the internal drives. This was the first time Apple used this high-speed Scuzzy, 4 times faster than the Scuzzy 1 bus. Between the 3 buses, you could connect 14 Scuzzy devices to the server. With the trays removed, you can see the entire backplane board. Well, most of the trays. I couldn't coax that bottom one out. You do not want to operate the server without the trays in place, or you would screw up the server's cooling system. The server has a translucent plastic door that slides across in front of the drive bays. The door has 3 positions. Aside from the obvious open and closed, it could be locked part closed, so no one could release the drives or push the reset interrupt buttons. Yet the removable media remains accessible. The reason for the door to be translucent was so you could see the light of the activity lamps with the door closed. Like I said, controlling the door position is a key lock, same style as the power switch on the Quadro 900 style case. Here, the key lock has 3 positions: locked, unlocked, and service. Just slide the door to the position you want it, lock it, and remove the key. Now villains cannot access your server. This also locks the power supply cover, by the way. As for the service setting, switch it there before you start up if you want to install the OS off disk or run a diagnostics disk. The server would come with 3 identical keys. There was an access lock in the back as well. Unix expects a 3-button mouse, but Apple supplied the usual 1-button Apple design mouse. The button represented the left button of a 3-button Unix mouse, and you used keyboard left and right arrow keys to represent the other 2. Way to invest in the new product line, Apple. So let's look at the back. The rear is all painted metal, yet it looks really clean and high-tech, and no yellowing plastic. Like I said, another key lock. It must be locked or the server won't power up, and you must unlock it to pull out the motherboard. This little LED glows green to tell you the server is on, and it will flicker to indicate Ethernet activity. There are 2 critical cooling fans, one for the drives and one for the motherboard. Pull down on the latch and angle it out. These are also hot swappable. It makes an electrical connection by contact and goes back in just as easily. There are grills just behind the front bezel, providing much of the makeup air. Now the motherboard. If we undo the 4 captive screws, we can pull out the motherboard. 2 solid handles are there to pull the motherboard out. So cool. It slides on standard drawer rails. If we peek inside the massive chamber, we see sound-insulating slab foam on the inside walls. You can see where the motherboard's data connection is made to the backplane board for drives via this mezzanine board. And lower down, we see where the motherboard plugs into power, with the scariest guide pins I've ever seen. The motherboard was originally planned to be an all-new design, but they ended up using a modified PowerMac 9500 motherboard. But Apple made sure it could not be used to run the Mac OS. Many have tried, but Apple worked pretty hard to lock it out, using a specifically built ROM card. Maybe the idea was so buyers didn't avoid aches and installed the Mac OS server software instead. As with all 604-based motherboards, the chip is on a daughter card. But this server daughter card is huge. way bigger than the Macintosh 604 processor cards, like this one I pulled out of a PowerMac 7300. Possibly Apple wanted more real estate on the card, so there would be more room to grow for multiprocessing, for example. Or might have been purposely sized this big to act as a baffle to control airflow in the case. Regardless, it's pretty barren. The motherboard itself has 8 RAM slots versus the 9500's 12. The server will not boot more than 512 meg of RAM anyway. The 500 server had a 512K L2 cache, same as the 9500, where the 700 server had a 1 megabyte cache. And if we look beneath the processor card, it has the same 6 PCI slots as the 9500. On the outside, you see where the PCI card ports would be. Again, really nice design. There is a left-hand panel area as well. You open this with a single captive screw. Here you can see the other side of the backplane board we looked at earlier. If this were a 700 model, I'd be able to add 2 additional non-swappable drives into a drive bracket mounted in this space, making a total of 9 drives inside the machine. It would be so cool to have a case like this to hold drives, instead of what I have now. The rear ports are pretty standard. Microphone and speaker ports, whatever you would need those for. ADB and serial ports. It features the first time Apple built in a VGA port for a monitor instead of using the usual DB15 port. It would be another 3 years before Apple would convert to VGA on their Mac line. You could still connect your Mac monitor with a simple adapter, but the monitor had to be a newer multi-sync type. No old single resolution monitors. Yeah, definitely not those ones. The onboard video had 1 megabyte VRAM, allowing it to drive a 20-inch monitor at 256 colors. I'm not moving that again. Really cool design. Now let's boot it. The power button is beside the floppy, and I believe the earliest example of a backlit power button, predating the 4400 and 8600. You could also use the power button on the keyboard. We hit the power, and we get the familiar Mac chime. Then we watch the LCD display as it posts. It comes up first with the ROM version and RAM, processor speed, cache. It may or may not be backlit depending on the ambient lighting. Now while doing this video, the machine started getting a bad sensor reading from the fan, meaning that after a short time, the server will shut itself down to protect itself. But it runs long enough to give us the server experience. It does a lot of self-checks, so it can take up to 5 minutes to fully boot up. After the post, it launches open firmware, and that's where you need a monitor connected. Once it finds a hard disk with aches, it will boot. For some reason, I have to give the system the address manually. If everything is good, the system will quack. I don't know. Each number that appears represents the stage that the bootloader is at, and you can translate with this guide. Now it runs the AIX operating system, and we log in. The server only runs Apple's custom versions of AIX, which were made in parallel with IBM's versions, and only for versions 4.14 through 4.15. Beyond the command line, there's a few system management tools on here. One is SMIT, or System Management Interface Tool. This gives you a lot of control, but not exactly Mac-like. If you wanted a graphical user interface, you could launch AIX Windows, which is like a poor man's version of Windows 3.1. It automatically opens to a terminal screen. It also features drop-down menus. Plus you get xClock. By picking System Management, we get all the same controls as we had in SMIT, as you can see. Hey, remember plotters? It also came with a more polished graphical user interface called Common Desktop Environment, or CDE, but it would not launch for me, so I can't show it. Obviously, Unix is not my expertise, so let's shut down. I'm shutting down, and with the language of the status messages, you'd think it was the end of the world. With the front switch in the lock position, it operates in file server mode, meaning in case of a power outage, it will restart when the power is restored. Not so unusual, many Macs also had this capability, using a power button that could be physically locked on. When the network server was cancelled, so was the server group itself. But Apple would continue to release workgroup servers, like the G3 server in 1998, and on into the future. Until Apple would again flirt with network servers with the Xserve, only to exit again when its consumer products really took off. The server is now back with its owner. I'd never get to keep something that big in the house anyway. In this video, I'm going to talk about the 20-inch Apple ColorSync display.
Take that thing back downstairs.
Okay, so that's it for the server. Thanks for watching, and I'll return to the Macintosh line in the next video. Thanks to John Purdy for giving me the opportunity to share his network server with everyone. In exchange, he got a rare tour of my collection. I'm glad most are enjoying the videos and wanting more. With life stresses like my neighbor,
Damn!
dangerous winter driving,
You okay?
Yeah.
a disaffected teenager,
Give him a high five.
you're leaving him hanging.
Give him a high five. Groundhog's like a feature around here?
Ethan, don't leave him hanging.
No, I'm not doing anything.
This old technology is an escape from all that, and I hope for you too.